Betrayal rarely announces itself with a roar. It usually creeps in through whispered phone calls and strange perfume on a tailored collar. Genevieve gave 10 years to a man who discarded her for a younger, flashier replacement, ensuring all of London high society watched her fall. Tonight he planned to parade his shiny new bride in front of her shattered ego. He expected tears. He expected surrender. What he didn't expect was a royal decree that would rewrite history. The rain in London always felt a little more cynical in November, slicking the cobblestones of South Kensington with a cold, unforgiving gloss. Genevieve Caldwell stood by the towering Gothic windows of the Victoria and Albert Museum's restoration wing, a cup of Earl Grey turning tepid in her hands. At 32, she had mastered the art of invisibility, a sharp contrast to the life she had lived only 14 months prior. 14 months ago, Genevieve had been the crown jewel of Carmichael Capital. She had been the dutiful, elegant wife of Tristan Carmichael, the self-proclaimed wunderkind of London's hedge fund elite. She was the woman who had paid his rent in a damp flat in Shoreditch, while he built his empire from a borrowed laptop. She was the woman who had hosted dinners for Saudi princes and Wall Street titans, smoothing over Tristan's rough, arrogant edges with her effortless grace and encyclopedic knowledge of art and culture. And for her decade of unwavering loyalty, she had been rewarded with a text message. It hadn't even been meant for her. "Can't wait to see you in the Maldives, baby. Just have to finish suffocating through the weekend with Jen, wearing the agent provocateur I bought you." The bottom had fallen out of Genevieve's world with the silent, terrifying speed of a severed elevator cable. The ensuing divorce was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Tristan, terrified that his investors would view his infidelity as a sign of instability, launched a preemptive strike. He hired the most vicious solicitors in Mayfair. He froze their joint accounts. He leaked carefully curated passive-aggressive statements to Tatler and the Daily Mail, painting Genevieve as a frigid, out-of-touch socialite who simply couldn't keep up with his dynamic lifestyle. But the true knife to the heart was Chloe. Chloe Sinclair was 24, a former minor reality television contestant turned lifestyle PR executive. She was loud, she was draped in conspicuous logos, and she looked at Tristan like he was a god who had descended from Mount Olympus. Tristan didn't just leave Genevieve for Chloe, he weaponized Chloe. He flaunted her at the Royal Ascot at Wimbledon, at private dinners in Annabelle's, where Genevieve's friends, people she had known for a decade, awkwardly averted their eyes and chose the billionaire's table over loyalty. Genevieve had walked away with a fraction of what she was owed, retreating to a modest flat in Chelsea and returning to her first love art restoration. She spent her days surrounded by 16th century tapestries and Renaissance oils, finding comfort in things that were broken, but could with enough patience be made whole again. It was in the quiet, climate-controlled silence of the museum archives that she met him. He had been introduced by the museum director simply as Arthur, a private collector seeking consultation on a series of damaged Flemish portraits belonging to his family's estate. He was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to rebel against his impeccably tailored tweed jackets, and he possessed a pair of sharp, intelligent hazel eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Unlike the men of Tristan's world who filled every silence with boasts of their net worth and stock portfolios, Arthur was a master of quiet confidence. He listened to Genevieve. Really listened. When she spoke about the chemical composition of lapis lazuli pigments, he didn't glaze over. He leaned in. When she accidentally dropped her magnifying loupe and cursed under her breath, he threw his head back and let out a rich, genuine laugh that echoed off the marble floors. Their working lunches turned into afternoon teas at the Wolseley. Afternoon teas bled into long, rainy walks through Richmond Park, far away from the prying lenses of the paparazzi. He brought her rare first-edition poetry books. She taught him how to distinguish a forged brushstroke from a master's original. It was only 2 months into their deeply private, intensely passionate romance that she learned the truth about his family estate. They had been sitting in his private library, a sprawling oak-paneled sanctuary in a historic townhouse near St. James's Palace, when she noticed the crest on a piece of personal stationery. Arthur wasn't just a wealthy patron. He was His Royal Highness Prince Arthur, Duke of Clarence IV, in line to the British throne. He was a working royal, a former military officer, and one of the most fiercely protected, notoriously private men in Europe. When she had confronted him entirely overwhelmed, he had simply taken her hands, kissed her knuckles, and said, "I introduced myself as Arthur because I wanted you to see me, not the crown, not the institution, just me. And Genevieve, you are the first person in my entire life who has looked at me and only seen a man." They had kept their relationship an absolute secret. Not even the rabid British tabloids had caught a scent of it. Arthur's security detail, the elite royal and specialist protection, RASP branch, ensured that their dinners were held in secure private dining rooms and their weekend getaways were completely off the grid. Genevieve, traumatized by the public spectacle of her divorce, was more than happy to exist in this beautiful, insulated bubble. But bubbles by their very nature are fragile, and the real world was about to crash into theirs. The annual Victoria and Albert Museum Winter Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the London social calendar. It was a night where aristocrats, tech billionaires, and Hollywood royalty collided under the sweeping glass dome of the museum's grand entrance. As a senior curator, Genevieve was required to attend. And as the CEO of a hedge fund desperately trying to rebrand himself as a high society philanthropist, Tristan Carmichael had purchased a £50,000 table right in the center of the room. Genevieve knew it was coming. The collision was mathematically inevitable. For weeks her stomach had been a knot of cold dread. She had watched Tristan and his new bride they had married in a flashy £1,000,000 ceremony in Lake Como 3 months prior dominate the society pages. Chloe was determined to establish herself as the new queen of London's elite, and erasing Genevieve's legacy was at the top of her agenda. "You don't have to go, darling," Arthur had murmured the night before, his arms wrapped securely around her waist as they stood by the window of his townhouse watching the rain blur the streetlights. "I can make one phone call to the director. You could be on a plane to my family's lodge in the Highlands by morning." Genevieve had leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid warmth. "No. If I run, Tristan wins. He wants me to be the tragic, discarded first wife hiding in the shadows. I won't give him the satisfaction." Arthur had pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Then you go, my love, and you hold your head higher than any of them. But promise me one thing." "What?" she had asked, turning to look up into his fierce hazel eyes. When the time is right," Arthur said softly, "you let me handle him." The Dorchester Hotel had been transformed into a holding pen for the ridiculously wealthy before the main caravan of black SUVs ferried them to the museum. Champagne flowed like water, flashing diamond necklaces caught the brutal glare of camera flashes, and the air was thick with the scent of Tom Ford cologne and desperation. Genevieve stepped out of her hired car, and the cold November air immediately bit at her bare shoulders. She wore an archival Oscar de la Renta gown, a breathtaking sculptural masterpiece in midnight blue silk that draped perfectly over her figure. It was entirely unadorned, devoid of the aggressive sequins and plunging necklines favored by the new money crowd. Her dark hair was swept up in a classic elegant chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of antique pearl drop earrings. She looked like a sergeant painting brought to life, composed untouchable and quietly devastating. As she walked up the steps and into the grand foyer, the ambient noise of the crowd seemed to dip for a fraction of a second. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. "Is that Genevieve Caldwell? I haven't seen her since the divorce. Good Lord, she looks magnificent." Genevieve kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her posture straight as a steel rod. She spotted several familiar faces, Viscountess Emma Weymouth, holding court near a massive floral arrangement Richard Caring, chatting with a politician, but she didn't stop. She made her way toward the coat check, desperate for a moment to collect herself. Well, if it isn't the ghost of Mayfair. The voice hit her like a physical blow. It was a voice she had heard whisper in the dark, a voice she had trusted with her deepest fears, a voice that had ultimately shattered her world. Genevieve turned slowly. Tristan Carmichael stood 10 feet away, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that somehow managed to look try-hard, his hair slicked back. He looked exactly the same, yet entirely foreign. Clinging to his arm like an expensive, highly strung barnacle was Chloe. Chloe was poured into a metallic gold Versace gown that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. Around her neck sat a blinding, violently large yellow diamond pendant, the exact necklace Tristan had once promised to buy Genevieve for their 10th anniversary back when they were still pretending he had a soul. Tristan. Genevieve said, her voice perfectly level. The chill in her tone could have frozen the Thames. She briefly let her gaze slide to the woman on his arm. Chloe. Genevieve. Oh my gosh, you came... Chloe's voice was pitched an octave too high, dripping with a venomous sweetness that instantly set Genevieve's teeth on edge. Chloe stepped forward, pulling Tristan with her, determined to close the distance. Tristan told me you rarely leave your little flat these days. I was honestly so worried about you. It is so good for your mental health to get out. Genevieve felt a dozen pairs of eyes lock onto them. The surrounding guests had sensed the blood in the water and subtly paused their conversations, shifting closer to eavesdrop on the drama. My mental health is perfectly intact, Chloe, Genevieve replied smoothly, taking a deliberate sip of the champagne a passing waiter had handed her. Though I appreciate the faux concern, it's very on brand for your PR background. Chloe's fake smile twitched her manicured nails, digging slightly into Tristan's tuxedo jacket. Tristan let out a patronizing chuckle, stepping slightly in front of his new wife, as if to shield her from Genevieve's intellect. There's no need to be bitter, Jen, Tristan said, adopting the faux pitying tone he used during the divorce proceedings. We're all adults here. In fact, Chloe and I were just talking about you on the flight back from the Maldives. The honeymoon was utterly exhausting, 3 weeks on a private yacht, you know how it is, but we wanted to send you a postcard. We truly want you to be happy. He wants me to break, Genevieve realized with sudden crystalline clarity. He wants me to cry. He wants me to cause a scene so he can point at me and say, look at the crazy, unstable ex-wife. Look how right I was to leave her. Genevieve offered a cool, terrifyingly calm smile. I'm perfectly happy, Tristan. Truly. And I see you finally bought the yellow diamond. It looks heavy. Chloe immediately brought a hand up to the massive stone, her chest puffing out. Tristan has been so incredibly generous. He spoils me rotten. He says a man's wife should be a reflection of his success. She delivered the line with a sharp-pointed look at Genevieve's unadorned neck. It's a shame you didn't hold on to him, Jen. But then again, some women just aren't built to keep a high-value man interested. A heavy, awkward silence descended on their immediate circle. Even some of Tristan's ruthless hedge fund buddies winced at the blatant cruelty of the remark. Genevieve felt her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face remained an impassive mask. She refused to give them a single drop of blood. A high-value man, Genevieve repeated softly, rolling the phrase around her mouth like cheap wine. Yes, well, I suppose value means different things to different people. Enjoy the gala, Tristan. Chloe. She turned gracefully on her heel, the midnight blue silk of her gown sweeping elegantly over the marble floor, and walked away. Behind her, she could hear Tristan's boisterous, overcompensated laughter as he loudly began bragging to a nearby duke about his firm's latest acquisition. Genevieve navigated the crowd, her vision blurring slightly at the edges. She found a quiet alcove near an exhibit of 19th-century marble busts and leaned against the cool wall, closing her eyes, trying to regulate her breathing. She had survived the encounter, but the night was young, and the true test, the sit-down dinner in the grand hall, was yet to come. By 9 o'clock, the gala had migrated to the spectacular Raphael Court for dinner. Beneath the towering Renaissance cartoons, 300 of Europe's most elite citizens sat at long, lavishly decorated tables, groaning under the weight of silver candelabras and white orchids. Genevieve found her assigned seat at a table near the front, a perk of being a senior curator. However, to her absolute horror, Tristan had apparently thrown enough money at the event organizers to secure the table directly adjacent to hers. For the first two courses, Genevieve endured psychological warfare. Tristan was in rare form, holding court, his voice booming over the string quartet as he regaled his table with tales of his immense wealth and Chloe's supposed brilliance. Chloe, for her part, made sure to lean across the space between their tables, at every opportunity flashing her diamond and offering Genevieve condescending little smiles. "We're looking at a townhouse in Belgravia," Tristan announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to Genevieve's table. "Chloe thinks it needs a total gut renovation. She has such an eye for modern design, not like the dusty, antiquated rubbish some people obsess over." A clear, deliberate dig at Genevieve's profession. Genevieve focused on her roasted sea bass, chewing methodically. Suddenly, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred in the atmosphere of the room. It didn't happen all at once, but rather like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The string quartet positioned on the balcony above abruptly ceased playing their Mozart piece and transitioned into a low, elegant, instrumental filler. Genevieve looked toward the main double doors of the hall. 4 men in stark, impeccably tailored black suits had quietly entered the room. They didn't look like guests. They had the lethal, coiled energy of men who assessed every person in the room as a potential threat. Earpieces glinted in the dim lighting. The RASP detail. A murmur rippled through the room, starting at the doors and spreading like wildfire. Wealthy aristocrats and billionaires actually stopped eating, craning their necks. Then the museum director, flanked by the chairman of the board, practically scrambled toward the entrance, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and awe. "Good heavens!" the elderly Lord Harrington whispered from Genevieve's table. "It's the Duke." Through the grand archway walked His Royal Highness Prince Arthur, Duke of Clarence. He was devastating. He wore a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket that perfectly secretly matched Genevieve's gown. His medals of honor earned during 2 tours in Afghanistan gleamed subtly on his lapel. He moved with the effortless predatory grace of a man born to rule his hazel eyes, scanning the sprawling room with an air of aristocratic boredom. The oxygen seemed to instantly drain from the Raphael court. This wasn't a minor celebrity or a flashy tech billionaire. This was the pinnacle of the global social hierarchy. This was untouchable ancient power. At the adjacent table, Tristan Carmichael practically vibrated out of his chair. Genevieve watched out of the corner of her eye as Tristan's predatory instincts kicked into overdrive. Arthur's charitable trust controlled billions of pounds in royal assets, and securing even a fractional partnership with the Duke's estate would elevate Tristan's hedge fund from mere wealthy to untouchable dynasty status. "This is it," Tristan hissed to Chloe, abandoning his wine glass. "The Duke is looking for green energy infrastructure investments. If I can get 2 minutes with him before he sits at the head table, Carmichael Capital is set for the next century. Watch and learn, Chloe." Ignoring basic protocol and the horrified looks of his tablemates, Tristan stood up and aggressively pushed his way through the chairs, intercepting the Duke's path down the center aisle. Genevieve's breath hitched in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Your Royal Highness." Tristan practically barked, stepping into Arthur's path and thrusting a hand forward with all the arrogant entitlement of a Mayfair finance bro. "Tristan Carmichael, Carmichael Capital. It is an absolute honor. I've been following your trust's pivot towards sustainable infrastructure, and I believe my firm is uniquely positioned to offer you a 50% yield increase on Alpro." Why? One of the RASP protection officers stepped forward instantly, a massive hand hovering near Tristan's chest to physically repel him. But Arthur simply raised a single-gloved finger. The protection officer paused, stepping back half a pace, though his eyes remained locked on Tristan's throat. Arthur stopped. He looked at Tristan's outstretched hand as if it were a piece of mildly interesting fungus. He didn't shake it. "Carmichael." Arthur set his voice a low aristocratic drawl that carried effortlessly in the now dead-silent room. "Yes, I'm familiar with the name. And the reputation." Tristan beamed, completely missing the lethal undertone. He puffed out his chest, glancing back to make sure Chloe and Genevieve were watching him conquer the royal family. "I'm thrilled to hear that, Your Grace. If I could just have a moment of your time—" "You misunderstand, Mr. Carmichael." Arthur cut in his tone, dropping several degrees, freezing the air between them. "I'm familiar with you, but I have absolutely no interest in speaking with you. Excuse me." The rejection was absolute. It was a public execution. Several people nearby actually gasped. Tristan's face turned a violent mottled shade of crimson. His hand dropped slowly to his side. He opened his mouth, stammering the legendary hedge fund swagger, instantly dissolving into humiliating panic. Your Highness, I assure you my portfolio." But Arthur had already moved on. He bypassed Tristan completely, not sparing him another glance, and continued down the aisle. He didn't head toward the VIP table at the front of the room. He didn't go to the museum director. He walked directly toward Genevieve's table. Every eye in the room followed the prince. The silence was so profound that Genevieve could hear the rustle of Arthur's velvet jacket as he approached. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Arthur stopped right behind her chair. He looked down at her, and the cold, terrifying mask of the Duke melted away, replaced by a look of such overwhelming, devastating tenderness that several women at the nearby tables audibly sighed. "Apologies I'm late, darling," Arthur murmured. His voice wasn't loud, but in the absolute silence of the room it carried like a gunshot. He reached down his large, warm hands, gently grasping Genevieve's shoulders. He leaned over and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the bare curve of her neck, right in front of 300 of London's elite. The entire room seemed to experience a collective stroke. At the adjacent table, Chloe Sinclair dropped her silver fork. It clattered against her china plate with a deafening clink. Tristan, who had just managed to slink back to his chair, looked as though he had been physically struck by lightning. His jaw hung slack, his eyes bulging as he stared at the Duke of Clarence, intimately caressing his discarded ex-wife. Genevieve slowly stood up, turning to face Arthur. She placed a hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath the velvet. "You're forgiven," she whispered, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking across her face. Arthur turned slightly, keeping one arm firmly, protectively wrapped around Genevieve's waist. He looked directly at Tristan Carmichael, who was now sweating profusely, looking completely terrified. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced, his voice ringing out with imperial authority, addressing the immediate tables, but ensuring his eyes remained locked on Tristan. "I don't believe you've been properly introduced. Considering the private ceremony we held at Balmoral last weekend, allow me to introduce my wife. Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Clarence." The silence that followed the Duke's declaration was not empty. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from the lungs of everyone present. To call it a shock would be a grotesque understatement. It was a seismic event that instantly rearranged the tectonic plates of London's high society. Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Clarence. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. At the adjacent table, Tristan Carmichael looked as though he had been abruptly gutted. The arrogant, chest-thumping titan of Mayfair finance was gone, replaced by a pale, sweating man who suddenly realized he was standing on the tracks with a freight train bearing down on him. His mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a beach trout gasping for water. Beside him, Chloe Sinclair was frozen in a rictus of horror. The massive yellow diamond resting against her collarbone, which only minutes ago had been her ultimate weapon, suddenly looked unspeakably vulgar. It was a bauble, a trinket bought with hedge fund bonuses. Genevieve didn't need diamonds to prove her worth. She had just been handed the keys to the British Empire. "Your Grace." The museum director stammered, practically materializing at Arthur's elbow, his face glistening with anxious sweat. He bowed deeply, completely ignoring Tristan and Chloe. "Your Royal Highness, we are profoundly honored. Had we known—" "My wife prefers to keep a low profile." "Director." Arthur interrupted smoothly, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal authority. He did not release his hold on Genevieve's waist. However, given the rather uncouth environment she was being subjected to, I felt an introduction was overdue. Shall we proceed to our table? Of course, immediately, Your Grace. Right this way. Arthur offered Genevieve his arm. She took it, resting her gloved hand against his velvet sleeve. As they walked toward the grand head table, the crowd physically parted for them. Awe, envy, and sheer terror radiated from the guests. Genevieve kept her head high, the perfectly tailored lines of her midnight blue gown gliding over the marble floor. She didn't look back at Tristan. She didn't need to. The sound of his social execution was still echoing in her ears. The rest of the dinner was a blur of exquisite champagne and deferential whispers. Genevieve sat at the right hand of the Duke, watching as the most powerful people in Europe practically broke their necks trying to catch Arthur's eye, desperate for a sliver of royal favor. Yet Arthur's attention never wavered from her. He poured her water. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her shoulder, and he watched her with a devotion so absolute it made Genevieve's chest ache. It wasn't until the dessert course, a spun sugar confection Genevieve barely touched, that she excused herself to visit the powder room. 2 RASP protection officers immediately detached themselves from the shadows to escort her, but Genevieve waved them back with a gentle smile. I'm just going to the ladies' lounge just down the corridor. I'll be perfectly fine for 2 minutes. The officers hesitated, glancing at Arthur, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. We'll be right outside the archway, ma'am, the lead officer murmured. The corridor leading to the restrooms was blessedly quiet, lined with towering neoclassical sculptures. Genevieve took a deep breath, pressing her cool hands to her flushed cheeks. She had done it. She had survived the lion's den, and she had emerged wearing the crown. Jenny. The voice was a desperate, raspy hiss. Genevieve froze. Stepping out from behind a marble pillar was Tristan. He looked entirely unraveled. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his silk tie slightly askew, and a sheen of frantic perspiration coated his forehead. He had clearly slipped out the side exit of the Raphael Court to intercept her bypassing the main security perimeter. Genevieve didn't flinch. She simply turned to face him, drawing herself up to her full height. Without Arthur's warmth beside her, the icy, untouchable exterior she had perfected over the last year snapped back into place. You shouldn't be here, Tristan, she said softly. A duke. Tristan stepped forward, his eyes wide and manic, completely ignoring her warning. You've been secretly dating no married to the Duke of Clarence. Since when, Jen? How did this even happen? You restore old paintings. My life is no longer any of your concern. Genevieve replied, her tone perfectly even. Now please step aside. Tristan ran a hand through his aggressively styled hair, ruining it. The sheer desperation radiating from him was pathetic. Jen, listen to me. I was out of line earlier, with Chloe. She's young, she doesn't know what she's saying. You and we built everything together. Carmichael Capital wouldn't exist without you. We have 10 years of history. He actually reached out, intending to grab her hand. Before his fingers could even brush her silk gown, a large, impossibly strong hand clamped around his wrist like a steel vice. Tristan yelped in genuine pain. Standing slightly behind Genevieve, having moved with the absolute silence of a ghost, was Arthur. His hazel eyes were no longer warm. They were obsidian, burning with a terrifying ancestral fury. I suggest you remove your hand, Mr. Carmichael. Arthur said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Genevieve's arm stand up. Before I allow my security detail to remove it from your body. Tristan yanked his arm back as Arthur released him, stumbling into the pedestal of a Roman bust. He was trembling. Arthur stepped in front of Genevieve, shielding her completely. You seem to be operating under a catastrophic delusion regarding your current standing in the world, the Duke said softly. You threw away a woman of immeasurable grace for a cheap imitation, and you assumed there would be no consequences. You assumed you could publicly humiliate her and still thrive in this city. Your Grace, Tristan choked on the words, unable to meet Arthur's lethal gaze. When you speak to my wife, Arthur interrupted every syllable a razor blade. You will address her as your Royal Highness, though given what is about to happen to you, I highly doubt you will ever be in the same room as her again. Run back to your table, Mr. Carmichael. Enjoy the rest of your evening. It is the last good night you will have in London. Tristan didn't say another word. He turned and practically fled down the corridor, his footsteps echoing frantically against the marble. Arthur turned to Genevieve, his expression instantly softening. He reached out gently, cupping her cheek. Did he hurt you? No, Genevieve whispered, leaning into his touch. But Arthur, what did you mean, what is about to happen to him? A slow, devastatingly handsome smile spread across the Duke's face. Let's just say I made a few phone calls while you were getting ready this evening. Come, my love. Let's go home. The Sunday papers executed Tristan Carmichael with the precision of a military drone strike. Genevieve sat at the polished mahogany dining table of Arthur's country estate in Berkshire, sunlight streaming through the French doors as she observed the carnage. The tabloids and broadsheets had united in their absolute adoration of the new Duchess, the Duchess of Mayfair. Genevieve's royal ascent screamed the front page of the Sunday Times. From heartbreak to highness, how Prince Arthur rescued London's most elegant ex-wife, declared the Daily Mail. But it wasn't just the glowing coverage of Genevieve that caught her eye. It was the brutal, unsparing destruction of Tristan. Paparazzi photos from the gala showed Tristan looking sweaty, panicked, and utterly defeated, while Chloe looked ridiculous in her oversized yellow diamond, completely eclipsed by Genevieve's understated regality. Society columnists gleefully dissected Tristan's embarrassing attempt to pitch the Duke, painting him as a desperate, new money grifter who had completely misread the room. But the true devastation was not happening in the tabloids. It was happening in the financial district. At exactly 9 a.m. on Monday, the glass doors of Carmichael Capital's headquarters in Canary Wharf flew open. Tristan stormed into the trading floor, coffee in hand, desperately trying to project an air of business as usual. But the silence that greeted him was deafening. The usual roar of traders yelling into headsets was absent. His CFO, Richard Pierce, was standing outside Tristan's glass-walled office. Richard looked as though he hadn't slept in 3 days. What's going on? Tristan snapped, pushing past Richard into his office. Why does it look like a morgue out there? We have the Japanese tech merger to push through today. Richard followed him in and quietly closed the door. The Japanese pulled out Tristan an hour ago. Tristan froze his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. Why we had a handshake agreement. They read the Sunday papers. Richard said, his voice flat. The CEO of Kyoto Dynamics is a traditionalist. He values honor and social standing. Seeing you publicly humiliated by the British royal family, seeing the Duke of Clarence refuse to even shake your hand, spooked him. He thinks associating with us is a liability. Tristan slammed his coffee cup onto the desk, brown liquid splashing over his keyboard. That's absurd. It's a society spat. It has nothing to do with our yields. It gets worse. Richard continued, ignoring the outburst. He dropped a thick leather-bound portfolio onto Tristan's desk. The Harrington Trust is liquidating their entire position with us. All £400 million. They've enacted the emergency withdrawal clause. All the blood drained from Tristan's face. The Harrington Trust was their anchor investor. Losing them wouldn't just hurt the fund. It would trigger a catastrophic domino effect. Lord Harrington. While he was at the gala, he saw... Tristan stopped. He remembered the elderly man sitting at Genevieve's table, Lord Alistair Harrington, the Duke of Clarence's godfather. "Oh, God!" Tristan whispered, falling backward into his ergonomic leather chair. By noon, word will leak that Harrington pulled out, Richard said, crossing his arms. When the anchor leaves, the rats flee. The Saudis are already requesting a meeting, and they sound angry. I've had 3 calls from the board of directors. They're calling for an emergency vote of no confidence this afternoon, Tristan. They want you out. They can't do that. I built this firm, Tristan yelled, panic finally clawing its way up his throat. You built it with Genevieve's connections. Richard corrected his tone, turning remarkably cold. You used her grace, her family's old money ties, and her reputation to get us into the rooms where the deals were made. When you dumped her for a reality TV star, the board warned you it was a bad PR move. Now you've made an enemy of the crown. You're toxic, Tristan. No one in Mayfair will touch you. Tristan scrambled for his phone. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped it twice. He finally managed to dial Simon Kensington, a tech billionaire he regularly played squash with at the RAC club. The line rang 3 times before going directly to voicemail. He tried another number, a prominent real estate developer. Voicemail. He tried a third. Disconnected. He had been excommunicated. Exiled from the kingdom he thought he ruled, banished with a single elegant gesture from a man who possessed true power. The door to his office swung open again, entirely bypassing the receptionist. Chloe stood in the doorway wearing oversized dark sunglasses and a Chanel trench coat, her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. Chloe, not now, Tristan barked, clutching his head. I'm dealing with a crisis. You're dealing with a crisis, Chloe shrieked, slamming her Birkin bag onto a side table. The real estate agent just called me the Belgravia townhouse. The seller backed out. They said they don't want to do business with our kind of people. Our kind. We have 40 million pounds in the bank. Tristan, not for much longer, Richard muttered under his breath, turning to leave the office. I'll start drafting your resignation letter for the board, Tristan. It'll look better if you jump before they push you. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving Tristan alone with his shrieking wife and the crumbling ruins of his empire. Miles away in the serene, sun-drenched conservatory of Clarence House, Genevieve took a slow sip of her Earl Grey tea. She set the bone china cup down on its saucer and looked across the table at Arthur, who was casually reading a report on agricultural subsidies. Did you do it? She asked quietly. Arthur didn't look up from his papers, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Did I do what my love? Dismantle his life. Arthur finally lowered the document, his hazel eyes meeting hers. There was no apology in his gaze, only a fierce, unwavering devotion. I merely highlighted a few character flaws to my godfather, Lord Harrington. The financial markets abhor instability, Genevieve. I didn't destroy Tristan Carmichael. I simply removed the invisible shield your presence used to provide him. He destroyed himself. Genevieve looked down at her hands. For a year she had carried a cold, heavy stone of betrayal in her chest. She had thought about revenge, of course. She had dreamt of screaming at Tristan, of throwing her champagne in his face. But sitting here bathed in the quiet luxury of genuine love and unparalleled security, she realized she felt absolutely nothing for the man she had once called her husband. The ghost of Mayfair was dead. The Duchess of Clarence had arrived. Besides, Arthur murmured, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. I promised you I would handle him. And a royal never breaks a vow. By Wednesday, the financial bleed had become a fatal hemorrhage. The board of directors at Carmichael Capital did not just ask for Tristan's resignation, they demanded it with the threat of a full forensic audit if he refused. Tristan was escorted out of his own glass and steel skyscraper by 2 burly security guards clutching a cardboard box containing a crystal Scotch decanter and a handful of vanity awards. He walked past rows of traders who suddenly found their monitors incredibly fascinating. No one met his eye. No one offered a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. He was a walking contagion. Stepping out onto the pavement of Canary Wharf, Tristan hailed a black cab, his mind racing with frantic, delusional plans. He would start a new firm. He would pivot to venture capital. He just needed to calm Chloe down, liquidate a few personal assets, and weather the storm from a beach in St. Bart's until the London social scene forgot about his humiliation. But when the cab pulled up to his rented 3-story penthouse in Knightsbridge, Tristan found a scene that shattered his last remaining illusion. A silver Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon was idling by the curb, the trunk popped open. Two private movers were hurriedly loading a mountain of Louis Vuitton luggage into the back. And standing on the pavement, flanked by her own newly hired security detail, was Chloe. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and scrolling through her phone, looking entirely unbothered. "Chloe, what is this?" Tristan demanded, dropping his cardboard box onto the pavement. The crystal decanter inside shattered with a muted crunch. Chloe slowly lowered her sunglasses, peering at him over the rim. The faux sweetness she had weaponized at the gala was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating glare of a survivalist. "I'm leaving Tristan," she said flatly, her voice devoid of any emotion. "My publicist secured me a suite at the Savoy until my flight to Los Angeles tomorrow. Leaving because of a bad week at the firm." Tristan stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Chloe, we're married. We can fight this. I still have the offshore accounts. I still have—" "You have nothing," Chloe interrupted, her perfectly glossed lips twisting into a sneer. "Your CFO called me this morning. Richard is a very practical man. He told me the board is bringing in the Financial Conduct Authority to review your ledgers. Apparently you've been aggressively commingling client funds to pay for our lifestyle. The yacht in the Maldives my yellow diamond paid for with money that wasn't yours." Tristan felt the street tilt beneath his feet. The secret he had buried deep beneath complex accounting maneuvers, the desperate leverage he had used to maintain the illusion of infinite wealth after the costly divorce was out in the open. "Chloe, please." Tristan begged, his voice cracking. He reached out to touch her arm. She recoiled as if he were coated in acid. "Don't touch me. I signed up for a billionaire Tristan, not a white-collar criminal facing a prison sentence. Oh, and you can forget about the offshore accounts. I had my lawyers draft an emergency petition this morning. As your wife, I've legally frozen the remaining liquid assets citing potential fraud. It's tied up in litigation now." Tristan stared at her horrified. "You're destroying me. You destroyed yourself the minute you embarrassed us in front of the royal family." Chloe snapped, sliding her sunglasses back up her nose. "My publicist has already brokered a 7-figure deal for a tell-all interview, Surviving the Pariah of Mayfair. It airs next week. Consider it my severance package." She climbed into the back of the G-Wagon and slammed the heavy door shut. Tristan stood completely alone on the pavement, watching the taillights disappear into the London traffic. He had traded a woman of immeasurable loyalty for a mercenary, and she had just slit his throat at the first sign of a sinking ship. Desperation breeds a unique kind of madness. For 3 days, Tristan locked himself in the empty penthouse, drinking cheap vodka and scrolling through news articles detailing his spectacular ruin. The FCA investigation was officially announced. His assets were frozen. He was facing multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. In his alcohol-soaked mind, there was only one person who could fix this. Genevieve. She had always fixed everything. She was the Duchess of Clarence now. One public statement from her one plea for leniency and the hounds would back off. He obsessively tracked the royal engagement calendar. On Saturday evening, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Clarence was scheduled to make her first solo public appearance, cutting the ribbon on a newly restored wing of the National Portrait Gallery. Tristan didn't have an invitation, but he knew the service entrances. He slipped past the catering staff wearing a crumpled suit that hadn't been pressed in a week, his face shadowed with stubble. He navigated the back corridors until he heard the polite applause of the main reception hall. He burst through the double doors, stumbling slightly on the thick carpet. The room was filled with elegant donors, museum board members, and flashing cameras. Standing at the podium, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the gallery spotlights, was Genevieve. She wore an emerald green Catherine Walker coat dress, a delicate diamond tiara resting in her dark hair. She looked ethereal, untouchable. Tristan shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate, echoing terribly through the refined silence of the gallery. The crowd gasped, parting instinctively. 2 massive RASP protection officers instantly lunged forward, their hands dropping to their holsters, ready to tackle the intruder to the floor. Wait! Genevieve's voice rang out clear and calm. She raised a single-gloved hand. The protection officers froze, though they positioned themselves directly between Tristan and the podium. Tristan fell to his knees on the carpet, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning whatever shreds of dignity he had left. The cameras flashed furiously, capturing every agonizing second of his humiliation. "Genevieve, please," Tristan sobbed, crawling an inch forward, before a security officer's boot planted firmly in his path. "They're taking everything. Chloe left me. I'm going to prison. You have to help me. Tell them to stop." "You owe me, Jen. We were married for 10 years. The room was so quiet that the whirring of the camera shutters sounded like a swarm of locusts. Genevieve stepped out from behind the podium. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked at the pathetic broken man weeping on the floor with the cold, detached pity one might reserve for a wounded insect on the pavement. "I owe you nothing, Mr. Carmichael," Genevieve said, her voice echoing with a regal finality. "For 10 years I was the foundation you built your fragile ego upon. When you thought you had outgrown me, you tried to bury me. You wanted me to break. You wanted me to disappear." Tristan wept into his hands, shaking violently. "But I did not break." Genevieve continued, her chin lifting. "I rebuilt. You assumed that my kindness was a weakness. It was not. It was a choice. And it is a choice I no longer extend to you. Escort him out, gentlemen." The protection officers hauled Tristan to his feet by his armpits, dragging him backward through the heavy wooden doors. His wails faded into the corridors, completely drowned out by the sudden thunderous applause of the gallery guests. Genevieve turned back to the podium, offering the crowd a flawless, radiant smile. "Now, as I was saying about the importance of preserving history," 6 months later, the British springtime had chased the bitter chill from the London air, painting the city in vibrant strokes of green and gold. The trial of Tristan Carmichael was brief and utterly merciless. Stripped of his high-priced legal team, he relied on a visibly exhausted public defender. His former CFO, Richard Pierce, testified against him in exchange for immunity, laying bare years of systemic fraud. The judge, an iron-haired woman with zero tolerance for financial vultures, handed down a sentence of 12 years in a high-security facility, citing Tristan's staggering greed and complete lack of remorse. Chloe's tell-all interview had aired to massive ratings, painting herself as the naive victim of a mastermind manipulator. It worked briefly. She managed to parlay the infamy into a short-lived line of cheap cosmetic jewelry before fading into the obscure neon-lit corners of Los Angeles, forever chasing the billionaire lifestyle she had so briefly tasted. Genevieve, however, was busy painting a very different legacy. On a bright Tuesday morning, a sleek black Bentley pulled up to a towering historic building in the heart of Mayfair. The imposing brass plaque beside the entrance, which used to read Carmichael Capital, had been removed. In its place was a beautiful slab of carved white marble, the Clarence Foundation for the Fine Arts. Genevieve stepped out of the car wearing a chic-tailored white suit. Arthur emerged beside her looking devastatingly handsome, in a charcoal gray tailored suit, his hand immediately finding the small of her back. With Arthur's backing and her unparalleled expertise, Genevieve had purchased the foreclosed property at auction. She had completely gutted the trading floors where Tristan had once screamed at underlings and orchestrated his frauds. In their place, she built sprawling, light-filled galleries designed to showcase the works of underprivileged emerging artists who lacked the connections to break into the elite art world. They walked into the grand lobby. The air smelled of fresh paint and expensive lilies. Sunlight poured through the massive glass atrium, illuminating the vibrant modern canvases that now adorned the walls. "It's breathtaking, darling," Arthur murmured, leaning close to kiss her cheek. "You've turned a monument to greed into a sanctuary." Genevieve smiled, looking up at the high ceilings. She felt a profound, settling peace within her ribs. The trauma of her divorce, the public humiliation, the terrifying freefall, it all felt like a lifetime ago. She hadn't just survived the fire. She had used the ashes to build an empire of her own making. I couldn't have done it without you, she said softly, turning to face him. Arthur shook his head, his hazel eyes burning with that same unwavering devotion that had saved her in the dark archives of the museum. I gave you a title, Genevieve, but the strength, the grace that was always yours. You were a queen long before I put a ring on your finger. He pulled her into his arms, and right there in the center of the lobby that had once belonged to the man who tried to destroy her, the Duke of Clarence kissed his Duchess. Outside, the bustling streets of Mayfair carried on. The hedge fund managers hurried to their meetings, and the socialites planned their galas. But inside the gallery, surrounded by art and bathed in light, Genevieve Caldwell had finally painted her masterpiece. A life beautifully, flawlessly restored. Did Tristan get exactly what he deserved, or was his downfall too brutal? There's nothing quite like the sweet poetic justice of a narcissist destroying their own empire while the woman they underestimated rises to royalty. If you loved this story of ultimate karma and high society drama, hit that like button to let the algorithm know share this video with someone who loves a satisfying revenge story. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next scandalous tale. What would you have done in Genevieve's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.